Good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you all to the Rogers Memorial Library. My name is Penny Wright. I'm the Director of Adult Programs here, and we're very delighted to have a discussion tonight by an officially acclaimed author. We'd like to thank C-SPAN Book TV for being here with us this evening. And when we progress to the question and answer segment, we will have a handheld microphone for you all to use when you ask your questions. We're also grateful to our local independent bookstore, Canio's Books, for being here this evening as well. We're most happy and grateful, however, to our visitor, our guest, Lawrence Goldstone. And I'll tell you a couple of things about him. He is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books of fiction and nonfiction, 6 written with his wife, Nancy, and has written extensively on both American and European history. Larry has been widely interviewed on both radio and television, with appearances on The Diane Rehm Show, on Fresh Air, To the Best of Our Knowledge, The Faith Middleton Show, The Takeaway, and Tavis Smiley, and now at the Rogers Memorial Library. His work has been profiled in the New York Times, the Toronto Star, Salon, and Slate, and his articles, reviews, and opinion pieces have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, and Hartford Courant. Larry's current book, Birdmen, The Wright Brothers, Glenn Curtis, and the Battle to Control the Skies, received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly and Library Journal. It was chosen as one of the best books of the year so far by Time magazine, and was the subject of an entire column by Joe Nocera in the New York Times. It also received glowing reviews in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Nature, USA Today, and the Christian Science Monitor. Larry is an eclectic fellow and has been a teacher, a lecturer, a senior member of a Wall Street trading firm, a taxi driver, an actor, a quiz show contestant, and a policy analyst at the Hudson Institute. He currently lives in Sagaponack. We're very delighted to have Larry and his wife Nancy and their family on the east end of Long Island. Please welcome Larry Goldstone.
Well, thank you, Penny. That was wonderful. And thank you all for coming. As those of you who are familiar with my work know, I don't specialize in any one topic. I've written on history of medicine, science, law, rare books, baseball. I'm looking for subjects where there's some current parallel with a historical topic, something that's acute, something that can illuminate the past and the present at the same time. This book I found through my favorite method of finding a topic, and I stumbled on it. It was just complete luck. I had been co-authoring a book on the biography of a Hall of Fame, New York Yankee Hall of Fame baseball pitcher named Lefty Gomez, and I was doing this with his daughter. And Lefty pitched in the 1930s. He was Babe Ruth's best friend. He was Joe DiMaggio's roommate. And Lefty was known for eccentric behavior and a series of kind of bizarre statements. What I discovered working, his daughter did this amazing job of interviewing Lefty before he died. And what I discovered about Lefty was that he was a highly intelligent guy with a voice somewhere between Mark Twain and the great sports writer Ring Lardner. And it very much belied the public image. But in public, Lefty was a very strange person indeed. And one of his famous loves was aviation. And in 1937, Lefty stopped pitching in a World Series game on the mound in front of a packed stadium to watch an airplane fly overhead. This was one of Lefty's. Now, what is less known about this story is that it was the bottom of the 7th inning and the Yankees were ahead like 11-2. So it wasn't quite as inflammatory as it came down through history, but it was a big deal nonetheless. What I discovered was that Lefty had acquired his love of aviation as a 6-year-old boy in 1915 at the San Francisco World's Fair, watching the most famous aviator of the age, a man named Lincoln Beechey. Now, I had never heard of Lincoln Beechey, and I did a little research, and what I discovered was that not only was Lincoln Beechey the most famous aviator or the greatest aviator of that age, but with apologies to Chuck Yeager, he was the greatest, probably the greatest aviator of any age. The things Lincoln Beechey did were so astounding that people wouldn't believe them except that he did them in front of hundreds of thousands of people. In a country where the population was like 75 million, an estimated 20 million people saw Lincoln Beechey fly. To give you an example, at the first great airfare, the great Chicago airfare in September of 1910, Beechey desperately wanted to break the altitude record. The altitude record at the time was 11,200 feet. Now, you have to remember, these people flew in airplanes that were completely open. There was no cockpit. It was just a frame. And they flew in suits. And the only way they could keep warm was to stuff newspapers in their clothes. And Beechey discovered that the only way to break the altitude record was to use all his fuel on the way up. So the last day of the fair, toward dusk, the megaphone man, that's what they had. There was a grandstand that held about 30,000 people, and there were 500,000 people packed along the lakefront. There are photos. There's just people packed the entire lakefront. The megaphone man goes up and down, tells everyone Lincoln Beechey is going to try for the altitude record. Beechey goes up. Sure enough, he gets to 11,641 feet. And they know this because they had a thing called a barograph that they mounted on the plane that used air pressure to measure altitude, which I don't completely understand, but it seemed to work. He's a dot in the sky. 500,000 people are watching. And all of a sudden, the dot starts to circle, gets larger and larger and larger, and the people see that the propeller isn't moving because Beechey had used all his fuel on the way up. And he's out over the lake, where if he crashes, he's going to certainly die. He circles down, and in front of 500,000 people, he lands his airplane in front of the grandstand, not 200 feet from where he took off. Now that is flying. Beechey's signature trick he called the dip of death. He would take his airplane 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet in the air, and then head straight down. Sometimes he would cut his engines. Sometimes he would put his arms out and control the airplane with his knees. And when it seemed like it would be impossible for him not to crash, he'd pull out and either perfectly land or go off and do some more tricks. He was the only person who could do this, and at least 6 aviators and maybe as many as a dozen died trying to what they call do a Beechey, because he was so famous. In those days, flying near Niagara Falls was certain death. The wind currents were terrible. The spray would foul the motor. Beechey, not only in front of 150,000 people, he flies under a bridge, goes to one of the falls on the Canadian side, and basically flies straight up it. He had an interesting sense of humor. In the next Chicago airfare in 1911, also in front of 500,000 people, Beechey announces that he has trained a woman, a French woman named Clarice Levasseur, to fly, and that Clarice Levasseur can fly as well as any man. Now, they had women aviators in those days, and one of which I'll talk about later, but there weren't a lot of them. And sure enough, the megaphone man comes. A woman comes out, Clarice Levasseur. She's a short, relatively stocky woman wearing a heavy coat to keep warm and a big hat, and she gets in the airplane and takes off. It is immediately apparent that Clarice Levasseur is not a particularly adept aviator. First thing she does is buzz the grandstand, and everybody has to duck. Then Then the plane maneuvers wildly and goes out over Michigan Avenue, flying so low that the wheels of the airplane are actually bouncing along the tops of the automobiles on Michigan Avenue. The plane goes again and goes out over Lake Michigan, just missing the water about 8 times. And this goes on for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then somehow Clarice seems to get her bearings, flies pretty well, does some tricks, and then lands perfectly in front of the grandstand. And the crowd is now applauding, probably in relief. Clarice Levasseur gets out of the airplane, takes off her hat, the wig comes with it, and there's Lincoln Beachey. All of these near-death things were his, that's how good he could fly. He could fly so he could bounce his wheels on the top of automobiles along Lake Michigan. Beachey was a kind of odd, well, you got a sense that he's an odd character. He's even odder. Beachey did not drink and he did not smoke. He had one vice, which he indulged in copiously and with great gusto, and that was women. He'd go from one end. Of course, he was very popular. All these people are seeing him fly. It didn't seem to bother him that he actually had a wife in San Francisco, but the wife took to chasing him around the country. Now, this is all, there are interviews of contemporary flyers, and believe me, I'm not making any of this up. And he was so nervous that she would get his money that he opened bank accounts. W.C. Fields did the same thing later, opened bank accounts under phony names all across the country. There are probably some of them that still have money in them. Ultimately, Mrs. Beachey got an undisclosed but sizable settlement in 1914. They got divorced. I did a little more research, and I discovered that while Beachey possibly was the most flamboyant, there were lots of other aviators who were also wonderful. And I put together, I said, this is a book. So I put together a proposal, which I called The Exhibitionists, The Romance of Death in the Era of Early Flight. Because a lot of the many of these aviators died in crashes doing these tricks. And I gave it to my editor. And he came back and he said, well, these people are interesting, but nobody's ever heard of them. Now, I thought that was a selling point, but my editor disagreed. And he said, well, maybe you can work the Wright brothers into the title. And I thought, the Exhibitionists, the Wright brothers, and the Romance of Death in the Era of Early Flight, it didn't have the same zip to me. But I agreed to research and see if we could get the Wright brothers in the book. And I must say I went about it with a bit of skepticism because there's been a lot written about the Wrights. And I wasn't really sure that there was anything new to find. Well, what I discovered was that there was a remarkable amount that was new to find, that there were large areas of their experience, both in the invention and what they did subsequently and who they were as people, that were either sloughed over, talked about only peripherally, or in some cases totally ignored. And that there was a great story there, and part of that story was their war, which I will discuss in a bit, with another great aviator, a great innovator named Glenn Curtiss. So I put together a proposal, which is now Birdmen, the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtiss, and the Battle to Control the Skies, and my editor bought that. Now, I am not going to extrapolate here and say the editor is always right, but in this case he was. The most important thing I learned about the Wright brothers was that they weren't clones, they weren't Siamese twins, they weren't two of the same people. They didn't work, this image that these two tinkerers working together in harmony, yes, they had their spats, but basically it was the smooth relationship in the back of the bicycle shop that resulted in the Wright Flyer. That isn't true. Wilbur Wright was the older brother, and he was the older brother more than chronologically. Orville was a great craftsman, a great technician, but Wilbur was a genius. And I will discuss in a second what his genius, how it manifested itself in the Wright airplane. But in addition to being brilliant, he could also be sarcastic, he could be dismissive, he could be overbearing, and he could be cruel. And he exhibited all of these traits from time to time toward his brother Orville. One example, in 1908, Orville is flying in a test in Fort Myer near Washington, D.C. to try to sell airplanes to the Army. and the airplane crashed. And Orville was horribly injured, broken femur, ribs. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks. And Orville lived to 1948, and he was in pain from that injury, from the injuries in that crash his entire life. Next to him was an Army lieutenant named Thomas Selfridge, who died in the crash, the first aviation fatality. Wilbur was in Europe trying to sell airplanes to the militaries of Germany, Britain, France, and England. And while Orville is in a hospital, he wrote to Orville blaming him for the crash and saying if he had been there, the crash would not have happened. It was so cruel that their sister Catherine, who was kind of part of the triumvirate, who was with Orville every day in the hospital, wrote back to Wilbur and said, what are you doing? Wilbur backed away after that, but he never apologized. On another occasion, they actually wanted to sell airplanes in 1907, and Wilbur went to Europe, and Orville crated up a Wright Flyer. They could break it down and put it in crates and shipped it to France. When Wilbur opened the crates, there were a number of pieces broken. Things were smashed. And Wilbur wrote this lacerating letter back to Orville. And it turned out that Orville had packed the Flyer perfectly, but the customs inspectors in Le Havre opened it, broke everything, put it back in, and again, Wilbur never apologized. So you had here a very complex, Orville never manifested that sort of behavior to Wilbur. Now, they were close. It wasn't like they loathed each other, but Orville, to me, was the classic little brother, and Wilbur was the classic older brother, and I think they had that kind of relationship. And this isn't just like family gossip. The relationship between the brothers and what they did and what they did not do bore directly on the invention and what happened with the Wright Flyer, and not only to Kitty Hawk, but afterwards. Wilbur worked alone. That's the other thing. We have this image of the two of them getting the idea together and working in the bicycle shop. Wilbur, from 1896 until before the first trip to Kitty Hawk in 1900, worked alone. All the letters, all the correspondence to the Smithsonian after asking for materials, to Octave Chanute, who was another aviation pioneer, it's I. Only before the trip to Kitty Hawk did it start becoming we in the correspondence. Because of Orville's sensitivity, Wilbur never let on that he hadn't been working with Orville the entire time. Wilbur died in 1912, Orville lived to 1948. In the last 36 years of Orville's life, he never credited Wilbur with anything individual. It was always them together, which is why most of the biographies and most of the things written about the Wright brothers have Orville and Wilbur basically the same, two sides of the same coin. While working alone, between 1896 and 1890, Wilbur had one of two great epiphanies. It is important, nothing in anything I wrote or anything anybody else wrote should detract from the utter brilliance of Wilbur Wright. Here is a man who did not graduate high school, never had an engineering course, knew nothing about aerodynamics, which was a formative science to begin with, who solved a problem that had stumped Isaac Newton, Leonardo da Vinci, and a host of the greatest thinkers in history. Wilbur was one of the great intuitive scientists this country has ever produced. Utterly brilliant. What he discovered was, Wilbur was not interested in speed, was not interested in the motor. All he wanted was a motor that was fast enough to create lift. What Wilbur realized was that the trick of controlled flight was actually controlling the airplane in the air. Everyone else, and there were lots of other people working at the time, everyone else thought that the best way to have an airplane in the air was to have it maximally stable, kind of like a car that you drive around. And what they did was they had the wings go slightly in a V from the center of the aircraft, which is called a dihedral. And that, for reasons I'm not going to go into, creates a great deal of stability in the aircraft. What you cannot do, however, is turn, except very broad and wide turns, and you're very susceptible to wind currents. What Wilbur recognized was the best way to create an aircraft that could fly successfully was to have an aircraft that was inherently unstable. The wings of the Wright Flyer, and if you go to the Smithsonian, you'll see it, actually go down a little from the center of the aircraft. That's called an anhedral. And that creates instability. But you must have a means of controlling the aircraft, and this is what Wilbur came up with a means called wing warping. And you know, it's funny because Wilbur got this from watching birds, and a lot of other aviation pioneers watched birds. Well, we live right near the ocean, and I go down and I watch birds all the time, and I'm looking for the same things they saw, and I don't see them. But I guess, you know, they were smarter than I was. But whatever it was, he saw that the wings vary. So what he did was, with a system of cables and pulleys, remember they were biplanes, the wings of one side would slant up when the other ones would slant down. And that corrected attitude. When the plane was losing attitude in one way or another, he could correct it, and he could also bank on a turn, which a dihedral airplane could not do. And he got the idea of banking on a turn, by the way, from their work as bicycle manufacturers. It is incredible how many aviation pioneers and automotive pioneers got their start in bicycles, with bicycles. Bicycles, which came in the 1880s, was one of the great inventions, and there have been some books written on it, but bicycles changed everything scientifically. So Wilbur came up with wing warping as his means of control. The second great insight he had, and this was after he started working with Orville, when they started working on powered flight, was that a propeller shouldn't be these little stubby things you find on boats, because aerodynamics was formative science. So they thought, well, they would take hydrodynamics and kind of apply stuff. Wilbur recognized that you needed a thin, elongated propeller, which is basically an airfoil, a wing, turned to the vertical. So they incorporate these, they go to Kitty Hawk, and in December 17th, 1903, they make their famous flights. And one of the most famous pictures, iconic pictures, photographs, is of Orville lying in the center of the airplane as it takes off in Kitty Hawk with Wilbur standing next to him. The irony there is that it was supposed to be Wilbur, because they took turns. They tried first on December 14th, but the plane had a minor malfunction, and it went straight into the sand. And it was Orville's turn next. So they do this, they fly, and it's one of the great events of scientific and human history. The only problem was nobody knew about it. They didn't go and publicize it. They didn't go to the newspapers. They didn't in any way let the world know what they had done. In fact, after Kitty Hawk, they did not fly publicly again until 1908. And while they flew at a place, there was a place called Huffman Prairie where they were perfecting their aircraft, and people came by, like farmers. The first accurate record of the Wright Flyer was in a bee journal done by a beekeeper who happened to see them fly in Ohio. And the reason they weren't, well, before I get to the reason, they're not flying public. In 1905, they stopped completely. In 1906, a Brazilian coiffier named Alberto Santos Dumont, living in Paris, builds this glorified box kite with a motor and a propeller and kind of bounces a quarter of a mile across a Bois de Boulogne. Headlines around the world, Alberto Santos Dumont is the first to fly, because nobody knew the Wrights had done it. Now, by that time, the Wrights said they had done it, but nobody believed them, and in France, they were called bluffeurs, because nobody believed they actually flew. And to this day, Brazilian children are taught that Alberto Santos Dumont was the first to fly. The reason nobody knew about the Wright brothers, and the reason they didn't announce it, was what their intention was, and they were completely open about this, was to establish a monopoly. Not just a monopoly on airplanes with wing warping, but a monopoly that would allow them to collect a licensing fee on every airplane that subsequently went into the sky. And they filed for the first thing they did, kind of the first thing after they got home from Kitty Hawk. They saw the folks, and then they went and hired Harry Tolman, who was a patent lawyer. And Harry Tolman filed their patent application. Another thing most people don't know, that the Wrights did not get a patent on a motorized airplane. The Wrights patent is basically on a glider. There's no motor, because Harry Tolman told them it would take too long. The patent examiners, it was going to be very difficult to get it on a motorized craft, so they filed for their patent, which they subsequently received, on a craft with no motor. There was a change in patent law by the Supreme Court, doing it on their own in the 1890s, which established something called a pioneer patent. And a pioneer patent meant that not only are you granted your patent for your particular manifestation, but if you've done something really cool and you've done something that advances technology by some order of magnitude, you can file for a patent that allows you to collect licensing fees not only on your invention, but anybody who creates an invention even roughly like yours. It's as if Bill Gates got a patent that allowed him to collect licensing fees on anybody who created software for personal computers. Now, we don't do that. Pioneer patents don't really exist anymore, but they existed in the Wrights' day, and that's what they wanted. And that's why they didn't fly. Now, it got to the point that they were trying to sell their airplane, but what they were doing, because of the delay in the patent, it didn't come in until 1906. Because of the delay in the patent, they refused to demonstrate their airplane. So they're trying to sell it to the American military, the German military, the British military, the French military. But what they are willing to do is give testimonials of the farmers and the beekeepers from Huffman Prairie who had seen them fly and show pictures. And they're asking hundreds of thousands of dollars from these governments, and they were frankly stunned that nobody was going to pay them that kind of money based on testimonials from beekeepers. As soon as Alberto Santos Dumont flew in 1906, other people, Henri Farman and other French aviators started getting very close. Just because you don't want to sell your product and sit on your product, it doesn't mean that the technology stops. And the technology did not stop. And they understood, the Wrights understood, they had no choice. They had to demonstrate the plane, which was why the crated Wright Flyer was sent to France that the customs inspectors trashed, because in 1907, Wilbur was going to try to sell it to the various European governments. And Orville had already, in the States, made overtures to the American government, and that was the demonstration in which Orville was hurt and that Thomas Selfridge died. So the Wrights fly first time in 1908. And at that point, they still had the best machine. There was no machine, none of these other formative crafts could do what the Wright Flyer could do. And the crash notwithstanding, people at Fort Myer were agape at what the Wright Flyer could do when Orville flew it. He just did things that people thought were impossible. And in Europe, Wilbur went from bluffeur to enormous celebrity. He used to wear this little cap, and people throughout Europe wore the Wilbur cap. He met royalty. He met heads of state. The things he did flying figure eights. Now, it was very formative flying, but it was so far in advance of what anyone else could do, certainly what Alberto Santos Dumont could do, and even some of the other French pioneers who were getting closer and closer, that he was just the toast of Europe. And the Wright brothers, when Wilbur came home, they gave them this huge ceremony in Dayton. Generals came, got testimonials from the president. It was just this enormous success. The irony is that at that moment in 1908, when the Wrights flew and the world toasted them, their aircraft had already become obsolete. Technology had caught up and would really catch up the next year. Because wing warping, if you think about it, you can't really do it. They're moving away. You got to have fabric wings in order to you can't really start twisting metal wings. And a better system of control, which was perfected by a man named Glenn Curtiss, who is the other protagonist of my book, were ailerons, which, you know, they had the biplane, were kind of little wings set between the upper and lower airfoil that would do the same thing that wing warping did. One would go up, one would go down, they would establish control, and they would enable Curtiss to turn. The Wrights got word that Curtiss was developing these airplanes. He had flown some formative flights. He was doing quite well. And they said, and the Wrights, remember I said, had gotten their patent in 1906, and they threatened him with a patent infringement suit. Curtiss said, this is nonsense. What I'm doing is nothing to what you're doing. It's completely different, and it's better. And he ignored it. And Curtiss went off to Reims, France in 1909 at the first great international air show, and he won the Gordon Bennett Cup, which was the single most prestigious award in aviation, and became the most famous aviator in the world. While Curtiss is winning the Gordon Bennett in Reims, France, the Wright brothers' lawyers are serving his wife in Hammondsport with papers for a patent infringement suit. Curtiss was an interesting fellow also. He did not start as an airplane pioneer. He started as a motorcycle. He built motors. He said he had a speed craving. His first job was as a bicycle messenger, and he raced bicycles. And he built motors. He got mail order motors. He decided to build motorcycles, and motorcycles were invented like in 1895, so they were pretty recent. And he got his motor, the mail order motor, and he put it together, and he said, I can do better than this. And he did. And in fact, in January of 1907, he built a 8-cylinder motor, mounted it on an elongated bicycle frame, and went to Ormond Beach, Florida, which is Daytona Beach, and set a land speed record of 136.7 miles an hour. The thing went so fast that he had to strap his body down because the wind would have blown him off. But he's building these motorcycles in Hammondsport. He's from Hammondsport, New York. His name is Glenn Hammond Curtiss, because his parents thought Hammondsport, which is up near the Finger Lakes, was such a wonderful place that they gave him their town's name as his middle name, which I'm sure made every real estate agent in Hammondsport happy. And he's building his motorcycles, and in California, one of the Curtiss motorcycles comes to the attention of a man named Thomas Scott Baldwin. Now, I could do 2 hours just on Captain Tom, even though he was never a captain, Professor Tom, even though he never went to school. Baldwin was born probably in Illinois, no one's really sure, probably somewhere in the 1860s, no one's really sure. His parents were either killed by Indians, killed by Confederate raiders, or abandoned him, nobody is really sure. He went to an orphanage, he ran away at some point, nobody's really sure of that either, and he probably got a job in a circus as a tumbler. One thing, the first time he came to public recognition was when he would get money for doing tumbling routines on the tops of moving trains. His first great move into aviation was Thomas Scott Baldwin, Captain Tom, was the inventor of the flexible parachute. They had parachutes before that, but they were rigid, which if they malfunctioned, they didn't really work, and the person went really fast. He invented the flexible parachute, and he put it to this use. He would go up in a balloon, 3,000 feet, sometimes 5,000 feet, jump out of the balloon, holding his flexible parachute. He was in no way harnessed. The only way he was attached was holding on to a ring, but he would do this for $1 a foot. And people paid him because, he was really strong. He really was an acrobat, and he could hold on to the ring. Obviously, he did because he lived through it. Captain Tom went to Japan. He went to Thailand. He was a world traveler. He was a charming raconteur. Everyone loved him. When he was in California, at the time he saw the Curtiss motorcycle, he was trying to create the world's first dirigible, which is a steerable balloon, a dirigible balloon. And he knew that what he needed was a lightweight, powerful motor. And he sees the motorcycle he sees the Curtiss motorcycle, and it sees G.H. Curtiss Manufacturing Company, Hammondsport, New York. So he writes away. Curtiss gets this order for a motor without the motorcycle part attached, but he fills it anyway, sends it out, and it works brilliantly. Baldwin really does create the first dirigible balloon, the first steerable balloon, takes it to a fair in Portland where the thing does he has amazing tricks. He has a really wonderful pilot they called the boy aeronaut, who delivered the first airmail. He went from one part of the town to the other and landed the dirigible. And this boy aeronaut, who was every bit as responsible for the notoriety that came to Baldwin as the balloon itself. Oh, by the way, there was Lincoln Beechey. Lincoln Beechey was the balloon. That's what he started as a teenager. Beechey, just to give you one other thing, he was world famous before he ever got on a fixed wing airplane. Beechey went to Washington, D.C. in 1905 and flew a dirigible around the Capitol. People were there are pictures of it around the Capitol building. Congress adjourned. They all ran out on the lawn to watch him. They invited him in for lunch. He said he wanted to land his airplane in the White House, but the president wasn't home because nobody thought you could do that in those days. And people in Washington, D.C., about an hour later started appearing with little buttons, little paper buttons saying, "Yes, I saw it." So Captain Tom goes east to meet Curtis. Curtis basically had never been out of central New York, and Captain Tom had been everywhere, including 5,000 feet up. Completely, Baldwin charmed Curtis. Baldwin charmed Curtis, and Curtis's expertise was intoxicating to Baldwin, and they started putting balloons together. They started working in concert. And then they went to fairs in various places. One of the fairs they went to was in Dayton, Ohio in 1906. And in Dayton in 1906, they ran into a couple of brothers who were rumored to have something to do with aviation. And Wilbur and Orville Wright and Thomas Scott Baldwin and Glenn Curtis seemed to get along well. And the Wrights invited Baldwin and Curtis back to their workshop for a chat. And what happened in that meeting is the single most controversial and pivotal meeting in the history of American aviation. The Wright brothers later claimed that they told Curtis everything, and he went off and stole their ideas. Curtis said this was nonsense. All he was trying to do was, they talked generally, and he was trying to sell them motors for the Wright airplanes. Now, the correspondence bears Curtis out to a great deal on this. He definitely was trying to sell the Wrights motors because letters would indicate that he was, and the letters went back and forth, and they were cordial. And also the notion that the Wrights, who would not demonstrate their airplane at that time to the heads of the military of Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, would give all their secrets to Curtis, seems a little far-fetched. But it is equally far-fetched that Curtis left that meeting with nothing. Because shortly thereafter, Alexander Graham Bell got in touch with him. Alexander Graham Bell was funding a group of people to try to develop fixed-wing aircraft. And Curtis became this remarkable innovator. Now, Curtis later claimed that he never used wing warping, and he did not, and that ailerons were superior, and they were, and that ailerons was something that they were working on with this group, which also seems true. But it is hard to believe that Curtis got no information, no insights, nothing that enabled him to move forward. Just one note. In a modern aircraft today, there isn't one single component we owe to the Wright brothers, except possibly the configuration of a propeller. The list of things, bless you, the list of things we owe to Glenn Curtis would fill 2 to 3 pages. Ailerons, wheeled landing gear, steering wheel, first man to have an airplane that could take off from a ship, first man that developed an airplane that could land on a ship, first workable hydroplane. The list is immense. Curtis was not the intuitive scientist that Wilbur Wright was, but he was an absolutely brilliant innovator, and for him to have been lost to history is kind of a crime. After that meeting, that is what caused the Wrights such animus toward Curtis. And they sued in 1909, as you know, and Curtis is often in France. And it set in what is called in aviation history the patent wars. Wilbur, also in 1909, the Wright brothers took in a consortium of investors, really rich guys. It was started by J.P. Morgan and included the Belmonts and the Vanderbilts and a lot of other very, very wealthy people. But other investors, just to give you an idea how powerful J.P. Morgan was, the Vanderbilts and the Belmonts would not invest if Morgan did because they thought he would push everybody around. I found that pretty impressive. Anyway, the idea was to get Wilbur back into the shop. He was president, Orville was vice president, and Wilbur simply refused. He pursued this patent case against Curtis, micromanaging it, talking to the lawyers. The last letter before he died was to Frederick Fish, who was his patent attorney, not to a family member, decrying how long the suit was taking. He died of typhoid fever. He had gotten really thin. He was always thin. He ran himself into the ground and died of typhoid fever in May of 1912. In February of 1913, the Wrights actually won their patent suit. They never collected a dime, and the reason, I'm running a bit out of time, so you're going to have to read the book for that. Orville Wright gave an interview to the New York Times in which he accused Glenn Curtis of essentially killing his brother by the perfidy that he had exhibited by openly stealing their ideas and refusing to pay them licensing fees, to which Curtis responded, no sane man would make that charge. Before I take questions, I just want to touch on one other aviator. I said that there were these remarkable aviators when Beechey was flying, and some of them were women. Well, there was a woman who, Amelia Earhart was doubtless a wonderful aviator and disappeared and probably died tragically. But before Amelia Earhart, there was a woman named Harriet Quimby. Harriet Quimby was born in a Michigan farm, moved to San Francisco as either a late teenager in her early 20s. She tended to lie about her age a little. She became an actress and roomed with a woman named Linda Arvidsson, who was also an actress, and they went through San Francisco. Harriet Quimby was also, by the way, generally thought to be the most beautiful woman that anyone had ever seen. Just everybody who saw her said, this is the most beautiful woman. And you see pictures, and they're stunning. They went, and they couldn't quite make their acting career go. So Harriet Quimby also doubled as a journalist. She wrote articles on Sarah Bernhardt and the daughter of the Chinese ambassador who came to America with bound feet, and all of these splashy articles, many of them for the San Francisco Call. Harriet moves to New York to works for Leslie's Weekly, which is a very popular weekly magazine at the time. Linda Arvidsson stays in San Francisco and becomes romantically involved with an actor. His name is Lawrence Griffith. And eventually they move to New York too, and Lawrence Griffith's acting career isn't taking off at all, so he decides to go into production and maybe this new thing called film. But Linda hated Lawrence, which I think is a perfectly nice name, and told him that instead he should use his initials, which were D.W. So D.W. Griffith is then making short films on Long Island. They reunite with Harriet Quimby. She is an actress in some. If you look on IMDb, Harriet Quimby has bit parts. She's writing screenplays for these. For Leslie's Weekly, she cajoles her editor into paying for flying lessons at the meet in Belmont Park, and she becomes successful, becomes the first woman to get a pilot's license. The year after that, becomes the first woman to fly across the English Channel. She designs her purple flying suit, which is a one-piece flying suit that converts into a dress, and became one of the most famous and was a great flyer. And she also tragically died in a Boston air show in 1912 either she fell out. They didn't, they were so formative. They didn't even use seatbelts until the seatbelts started coming in 1910, a little bit in 1911. Whether Harriet was wearing some kind of restraint is unclear, but she died when she fell out of her airplane. And I mean, to me, this is just such a remarkable woman, and for her to have been lost to history is a tragedy, as Curtis and Beechey and all of these pioneer flyers. So in addition to the Wright brothers and Curtis, which I hope is a strong story, that I could bring some of these people back was just a great privilege for me. So I'd love to take some questions. Now remember, you have to wait for the microphone. Anyone? Yes, sir. Wait.
I read the book. You didn't bring out now that Beechey died in that maneuver that he was doing.
You read the book, but some of the people watching may have not have bought it yet, and I was hoping to leave that part out.
But okay,
but
the question I have
since
is,
you have let the cat out of the bag, yes, Beechey died.
well, most of them did die. Most of them.
Yes.
My question is that when I read the book, to me there was a space where you just briefly mentioned about the horizontal lift, which is the propeller. You really didn't go into too much detail about how the Wright brothers worked on it. I mean, in other words, the other things that you were speaking about was very coincidental on what they were doing, but that part left me with a bit of a blank on how they actually came to the epiphany, as it were, to put that propeller, that elongated propeller, on this Wright flyer, because most of their experiments, like you said, was done with was gliding, really, and then they came to the final.
Okay. Most of it, it's a balancing act in a book like this. I wanted to have enough science, but you can't have too. Most of it was trial and error. In fact, one thing that is in the book, the wind tunnel had been invented already, but it was very imperfect. And when the Wrights realized that the wing, which of course is curved on the top, is called a camber, to allow the air to move faster over the top. That's Bernoulli's principle and lift and all of that. The camber has to be exactly right. The high point is not in the middle. It's closer to the front of the wing. And they were having a problem because they were using the tables done by another aviation pioneer named Otto Lilienthal, and it wasn't working. And so they more or less invented, even though there had been primitive wind tunnels, they more or less invented a wind tunnel to come up with a better airfoil. But most of what they did in those trips to Kitty Hawk were trial and error. They would try stuff, the plane would go in the ground, it would tilt. So they would change the measurements. Orville really was a remarkable master craftsman. And they would just take thousands and thousands of measurements. They would try different things until they found one to work. In fact, after the first year in Kitty Hawk, they thought it was all going to be wonderful. They went back the second year, it was a disaster. They couldn't get it to fly. It kept crashing in the ground. They had to go back. That's when they had to go back and reformulate everything. So, yeah, I mean, I wanted to avoid making it too technical. I will say, however, that Nature magazine, which is one of the preeminent, said I did not stint on the science, which was extremely gratifying to me because my daughter reads that magazine, and I was terrified of a bad review there.
Blank space is when they put that propeller on it. I mean, it wasn't there. So.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes? My extremely talented assistant is on her way with the microphone.
Were there any other stories that you came across that you regretted not having space to include?
Probably about 1,000. The people who were flying were so remarkable. Remember, there were no test pilots. These people were the test pilots. That's why so many of them died, because they were trying out concepts. They were trying out things that were completely new. Half of the Beechey story I couldn't fit in. There were other aviators. There was remarkable progress in aviation in Russia at the time, which there was no room in the book for at all. There was a lot of the Wright brothers material. One of the reasons I made the decision I did about the Wright brothers is there is so much written about them that I wanted to spend a lot of time on the places where people didn't cover it. For example, and this is in the book, but they were all terrible businessmen. Curtis and Curtis hooked up with a guy named Augustus Herring, who was this major fraud, and the Wright brothers, I said, didn't go back to the shop. And there's correspondence between a man named Andrew Friedman, who was the people the investors put up to handle the business end, between Andrew Friedman and Wilbur Wright, which are incredibly illuminating, and I could only put in a couple of those, where Friedman kept saying, what's going on? You're supposed to be making new airplanes. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you at this air show? Curtis is at this air show. Why aren't you at this air show? And you get a flavor for that. So what I tried to do was to hit everything that needed to give you the picture, impressionistically, of everything you needed to know about the story I wanted to tell. But there was just there's vast areas that, I could have made the book three times the length. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yes, you said that the list of contributions that the Curtis made was much longer than what the
Yes.
Wright brothers made, but weren't the Wright brothers the ones that did all that trial and error to make the discoveries about the wing and the importance of the
Yep.
mechanism for steering, or were other people at the same time making those discoveries? You said there was a Brazilian and the Russian. Did
Well,
they?
the Brazilian wasn't. But there was a man in Egypt. That's a really good question. There was a man in Egypt. There was a man named Octave Chanute, who I mentioned just in passing. Octave Chanute was the most famous civil engineer in America. He built bridges across the Missouri, and he retired with great wealth and became kind of the clearinghouse for information. Octave Chanute was the first, after Wilbur wrote to this, when Otto Lilienthal died in 1896, Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian to get materials. The first man he really corresponded with to try to refine his ideas was Octave Chanute. Chanute, everybody in the world was essentially sending him notions and sending him plans, and some asked for money. And there was a man named Mouillard in Egypt who may or may not have come up with the idea of changing the orientation of the wingtips. The Wright brothers denied it, and they're probably largely right, but it's the same kind of situation as you had with Wright and Curtis. The technology is moving forward. If Wilbur Wright hadn't discovered this, somebody was going to. But Wilbur did it, and we reward that and should reward that because it was utter, insightful, intuitive brilliance. So yes, we owe the Wright brothers a debt, but it was also a tragedy that after December of 1903, there was not a single innovation that either of those brothers made that not only we have in modern aircraft, but were in aircraft at the time. Their aircraft, in fact, when people started flying, doing the stunt flying and doing more difficult flying, that's when flyers started to die, and they died disproportionately in Wright aircraft because the wing warping was not good in tight turns and in stressful flying. So yes, there is no underestimating what Wilbur did, and Orville too, for his part in the process. But it is equally true that technology doesn't simply stop. Now, I don't know the man. I think it was John von Neumann who did ENIAC, which is the first computer. Well, nobody talks about him. We talk about the pioneers that came subsequently. So there's a kind of a place for both. I can take one more, I think. No, wait. You have violated protocol. Yes.
What patents could they have possibly had? I mean, they basically were flying a kite. So how could anybody there after them infringe on, what was so important about the camber of the wings, which is basically what they did?
Well, if the camber of the wings is wrong, the aircraft will do this.
So all they had was the camber.
No. It was also a means of control. Otto Lilienthal was a German, and he lived outside Berlin, and he formulated wings, actual 30-foot wide wings, which he braced himself against and ran down a hill and glided. And if you looked at pictures, you'd say, oh, that's just one of the nuts trying to, but Otto Lilienthal took tens of thousands of measurements of different airfoil shapes. So those tables that the Wright brothers used first, the camber of the wing was known. What the Wright brothers what they patented was this ability to change what they called the lateral margins of the wings and control the aircraft in flight. And nobody had done that before. The broad flat turns were the best they could do before that. And these early airplanes were very susceptible to shift in wind where they crashed a lot. So the Wright brothers invented the first controlled powered flight. And the motor was weak, but they changed that later. So, no, their invention, they deserved a patent. Whether they deserved a patent to take in everything that was done subsequently, that is unclear. But they definitely deserved the patent on their invention, and anybody who used it, they should have had to pay for. But when ailerons came in, that was that. So yes?
I want to mention, actually, that we have at least 2 pilots in our audience. We thank you for coming. And we're going to thank you, but could you just end by telling us if what you're up to next, and if this obvious huge interest that you have in this subject, which you have made very interesting for the reader, has that brought you to another line of thinking of writing about?
Well, Penny, thank you for that question. And despite what anyone thinks, I didn't even need to pay her to ask me that. I'm actually working on a similar book called Horseless, about automobiles, which is the same kind of study of the progress of technology and the innovative process, which focuses on Henry Ford, who I don't want to give too much away, but where the Wrights were brilliant. The Wrights were brilliant innovators, but not particularly good businessmen. Henry Ford, I think, is something of an overrated innovator, which I think the reader will see, but an utterly brilliant businessman. And so that's what I'm working on now. And thank you so much for that.
We would all like to thank you, Larry. It's been fascinating and illuminating. And we will be back for your next book reading when it's finished. And thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Thank you.